Hello, and welcome to Why Do We Do That? A psychology podcast that deconstructs human behavior from the perspectives of social scientists, psychologists, and others that use applied psychology in their work. I'm your host, Dr. Ryan Moyer. In this episode, I sat down with Professor of Psychology and Director of the Frost Center for Social Science Research at Hope College, Dr. Daryl Van Tongeren. Daryl completed his PhD in experimental social psychology at Virginia Commonwealth University in 2011. In 2016, he was named an Association for Psychological Science Rising Star. He has over 250 scientific publications, including 4 books, on topics spanning meaning in life, religion, and virtues, and his work has been supported by numerous external grants. His work has been highlighted on Hidden Brain, the New York Times, the BBC, The Atlantic, and many other media outlets and podcasts. He's an associate editor at the Journal of Positive Psychology and a consulting editor at Psychology of Religion and Spirituality. His newest book is entitled Done: How to Flourish After Leaving Religion, and was the focus of our conversation. Daryl and I sat down to explore the experience of leaving religion and what his research reveals about the psychological and social dynamics involved. One of the most striking ideas that stayed with me was how deeply interwoven religious identity can be with nearly every aspect of a person's life. When someone begins to step away from their faith, it's not just a shift in belief, it's often a reorientation of intellectual convictions, core values, views on morality, and even one's entire social world. The label we choose for ourselves in relation to religion can quietly shape how we see everything else. When foundational beliefs become tied to our identity, questioning them can feel deeply unsettling. Many people hold tightly to their faith, not always out of certainty, but out of fear of what might unravel if they let go. Yet for those who do take that leap and de-identify, a surprising number discover that new worldviews can be just as meaningful, if not more so, ones that align more closely with their evolving understanding of the world. Our conversation also led me to reflect on how religious beliefs are just one example of the kinds of convictions that shape us. Political ideologies, views on human nature, cultural narratives, these too can become so fused with our identity that we resist any challenge to them. Developing morals, values, and a coherent framework of understanding the world is essential. But conviction must be paired with flexibility. Without the willingness to revise our beliefs in light of new information, we risk organizing our identity around ideas that no longer serve us, ideas that may not reflect the world as it truly is. If you are currently wrestling with doubt about your religious beliefs, or have recently stepped away from a long-held faith, I hope this conversation offers some clarity, and perhaps even comfort, as you navigate what comes next. Enjoy. Okay, today I am joined by Daryl Van Tongeren. Thank you so much for being on today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Daryl's new book is called Done: How to Flourish After Leaving Religion. So we're going to be talking about this book and the topic of leaving religion. We're going to take a deep dive into the motives behind leaving religion, the whole process that goes into this. Obviously, I think most people can see that religion has been declining, at least in the U.S., in the last 20, 30 years or so. One of the big headlines has always been the quote-unquote rise of the nuns, which is the increase in the number of people that when you ask them, what is your religious identification, they write none. But in your book, in the very beginning, you draw this distinction between nuns and duns, people that were formerly religious that are no longer religious. Why don't we start by talking about why you think that distinction is important?
I think it's an important distinction because non-religious people are a diverse group. There's a considerable amount of heterogeneity in the religious nuns. And some of our earliest work found that someone's religious history matters. So you can imagine two people who would indicate none when they're asked their religious affiliation. One person has never been religious. The other person was formerly religious, but no longer identifies as religious. We would call these people who have left religion duns. And what we found is that among these duns, that aspects of their religious upbringing tends to linger, something that my colleagues and I call religious residue. So after leaving religion, it's not as simple as just walking away. Religion is sticky, it persists, and that religious residue shows up in a host of areas in the ways we think, the ways we feel, the ways we behave. And so the distinction between duns and nuns is an important one because by identifying that duns, which would be a subset of nuns, have left a religious upbringing, we can see what the lingering effects of of their upbringing might be and how that might affect not only the process of leaving religion, but also crafting a meaningful worldview, relating with other people, and orienting their lives and identity around a set of values after they've left religion.
So when you step back and you look at this process of changing identification, how much of it do you think is due to just a subtle shift in their label for themselves, a language shift, as opposed to deep changes in personal beliefs? So I guess what I mean by that is, you take someone who has always been, let's say, a casual Catholic. They're not super dedicated to their Catholicism, but they would identify as Catholic. But they're at some point maybe they learn the term cultural Catholic, which is someone that embraces the cultural norms and some of the habits, but rejects some of the supernatural stuff. And then they start calling themselves cultural Catholic, or maybe they even change their identification altogether. But for this hypothetical scenario, their beliefs have remained the same. It's only just grabbing a different label. So, in your view, like, what's more common? Is it just the beliefs are stable and the label's changing, or is it a little bit more complicated than that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I do think that that is some of what's going on, but it's certainly not the whole story. It doesn't capture the whole thing. So I think you're partly right. I think for some people, as increasingly more people are leaving religion, they feel more comfortable saying, you know what, I'm not religious anymore, or they feel more comfortable shifting their identification. Maybe they feel like the term religious or evangelical or Catholic or whatever it may be is just this problematic label that they don't want to be attached to. We saw this a fair amount in response to the US election after 2016. And a number of people said, well, if so many religious people, voted in a particular way or being associated with a particular set of values, and that's no longer congruent with my values, well, I guess I just can't call myself religious anymore, or I can't call myself that denomination anymore. So I think for some, it is a linguistic shift or a change in how culturally we think about and use language. But for many others, and I think this would be a large number of folks, there really are significant changes happening. Whether that's in what people believe about the supernatural, the way they try to engage or relate with the transcendent, the moral guidelines they allow religion to affect their behavior or their affiliation or disaffiliation with a religious community. And so for many people, it's more than just linguistic. It's a deep cascading effect that comes from a change in a core feature of their identity. And for many people, religion was the primary lens through which they viewed and made sense of the world. And now they're shifting in meaningful ways that's having significant consequences in their post-de-identification transition to something else.
You lay out four large motives that you see for why people leave their religion. I guess you just touched on one of them, which is that problematic label, which it's very interesting to me that that there's this uh, strong social. It seems as though that's the only one that's a social reason for changing, where it doesn't really address any deep inconsistencies in someone's worldview. But you also talk about three others. Let's start with cultural stagnation, right? This idea that you talk about that someone's worldview doesn't necessarily match their religious views anymore, um, and or that the religion itself is not evolving with the in the same rate as the culture. So you have new issues popping up that doesn't fit. What are some of the what are the common areas of culture that you tend to see a discrepancy in when it comes to the religious teachings?
Yeah, right. So with cultural stagnation, exactly right. Usually people are becoming more progressive, whereas their religious institutions are remaining stagnantly more traditional conservative. They're not keeping up or evolving with the times. So some of the areas where we might see this come up would be issues around gender, sexuality, race and ethnicity. So you can imagine areas in which a lot of progress has been done with social justice and working towards equity, and religious institutions just aren't as quick to or might be resistant to adopt such changes. I think with the first time in U.S. history where the number of men attending church outnumbers the number of women, and so that's been a significant shift. And part of that might be driven by a number of religions in the U.S. don't purport that women can hold equal status of leadership in a church. And so it could be a case that just some women might have thought, well, goodness, I think, it's time for me to go. I'm no longer holding those beliefs, and there's no longer an alignment.
Do people try to, I guess, integrate these discrepancies as they come up into their religion? I guess I'm thinking of a scenario where you have this observation that the church is not willing to be open to, for example, female pastors or something like that. Um, do people make small steps, like maybe they change their denomination, or maybe they move to a different church that would be a little bit more open first, or does it tend to be a more dramatic shift where you have this deep what as you call in the book cognitive dissonance that has to be resolved via some other dramatic way?
No, I think you've got it exactly right. I think in the beginning, people tend to make small concessions, right? Well, maybe these two things go together in this way. But as the discrepancies begin to accumulate, there's only so many mental gymnastics that we can do to try to make everything coherent and fit together and make sense. And so I do think you see some people will shift and try to find, for example, more affirming denominations or more progressive denominations. And for some, it could just be that even after all of those mental gymnastics, even after kind of rearranging a set of beliefs that is more in line with teaching or finding a denomination that more closely aligns with one's personal values, the distance is still too great. There's still too great of a discrepancy, and they just simply can't make sense of certain features. So, for example, this is kind of related to some of the other reasons, but if people just can't make sense of suffering and adversity, and there's a particular orthodoxy in what's preached in most religious teachings in a particular faith, it could be no matter how progressive you get, if your denomination still is preaching this eternal conscious torment of people who don't agree with your faith identity, that might just be kind of a hard pill to swallow. And as progressive as they might be, you might not be able to get your head around the idea of a conscious hell or something like that. And so the only thing that makes sense is to de-identify.
In the book, you don't really spend a lot of time addressing any specific denomination. You talk about religion as a very broad concept, belief system. Um, did you, in your research, find any interesting differences across the specific denomination. So, for example, were Protestants different from Catholics in terms of anything that you measured versus Islam or Judaism?
That's a great question. So the work that we're referencing and the research on which this is based was drawn from cross-cultural samples. So US, Netherlands, Hong Kong, United Kingdom, New Zealand. And so we had a bit of fair representation of different religious groups across those different countries. We haven't found huge reliable differences between denominations on a number of the things we're discussing. But I will say this, we're currently conducting a study right now that's looking at what we call high cost religions. So people who are leaving religions where the cost of doing so is rather significant. And
Interesting.
so, for example, you might think of ultra Orthodox Judaism, right, where the men of this faith tradition are going to synagogue 21 times per week, right, or Latter-day Saint affiliated individuals. Leaving those types of organizations or faith groups incurs a much higher cost than if you are a Christmas and Easter Episcopalian and you decide, to free up two more Sundays from your calendar. Right? Again, not diminishing the significant change in identity that might be for someone, but what we're trying to drill down is how much does it affect this transition in this process if someone's entire life, their entire worldview, they've invested so much cognitively, their identity is in this. The group might be particularly insular. It's basically the centrality of religion in someone's life, we think, is going to make it much harder for someone to leave and much more likely for there to be this religious residue that lingers after people do.
Mhm. It reminds me of some work uh, that I really like. That it's in an area of psychology called dynamical systems for the listeners, and dynamical systems as it applies to psychology. And there's some work that looks at nonlinear changes in beliefs, and I'm curious if you think that religion or leaving religion fits the same pattern. And the pattern is, I guess it's best described in terms of like a romantic relationship, which is if you're in a long-term romantic relationship and you're happy, but then certain things start to happen and you become less happy, and maybe your commitment starts to fade as you notice certain behaviors in your partner. Um, and oftentimes in long-term relationships, these negative observations build up. They build up, and then the person dramatically flips from being in love with their partner to, being disgusted. Like, I don't want to be with you anymore. And in this very non-linear way, in the sense that if you picture a scale from positive to negative and the middle being neutral, people don't go from positive to neutral. They go from positive all the way over to negative in this at the same level of intensity. And all of this happens because over time, these observations of their partner, leaving the toilet seat up, being rude to people, all these little elements are being put into a bucket, and they're being put aside, and that it takes one event and then the evaluation completely flips. Do you see that similar pattern of that dramatic flip with religion?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think there's always going to be individual variation with folks, and so if I lay out a blanket statement, I'm sure someone will reach out and say, you didn't capture mine quite right. So the way we've kind of heard about it when we ask people is it's almost kind of one in two ways. So for some, it's almost like a small iterative process where someone was describing this to me. They said, I used to be seated at the quote unquote the table of faith. And then I just kind of slid down a little bit more and a little bit more, and a little bit further down the bench. And eventually, just one day I realized I was no longer sitting at the table. And so for them, it's like it just kind of gradually lost its importance. But for other people, I do think we see what you're describing, and that's they keep trying to hold all these things together. They're trying to hold together aspects that they have previously found to be dissonant. They're going through all types of mental assimilation to try to fit these pieces together. And then at one point, one piece of information or one event happens, or something is just pushes the cumulative discrepancy over a potential threshold where it just becomes no longer tenable to hold those beliefs, or it becomes no longer tenable to stay engaged with that community. And whether that's the accumulation of a number of small little discrepancies or one large traumatic or grief-stricken loss or adversity that just completely flips the balance. And so I do think for folks there is a threshold, and whether they get there gradually and kind of less noticed or rather noticeably through the accumulation of small or one big event, I do think that what you're describing happens. And it's almost like, unless it just generally loses importance, if it's been an important part of your life, yeah, you're not really going to go from I love this, I love this, I love this to like I'm just medium or I'm neutral about this, right? This is going to be very disruptive, right? This is going to be feelings of grief and loss, anger, shame, frustration, confusion. Yeah, it's not going to just be a slight shift into neutrality for most.
Yeah, the research I was alluding to kind of establishes the that initial level of importance is the predictor. So things that, in terms of attitudes shifting, if it's not important, you can kind of slowly turn down the volume. But when you take a
Yeah.
belief that is of super high importance, it's tied into your identity, something like a fundamentalist type model of religiosity. Those are the types of scenarios where you might see that what we call a catastrophic shift. I want to talk a little bit about the outcomes after people leave religion, and you draw a distinction between those that de-identify and those that reconstruct. And we kind of touched on that already, which is that some people might try to take the pieces of their religion and rearrange them in a way that suits their needs. Others might just say, you know what, I'm not going to identify as this label anymore. Do you see differences in outcomes based on if people reconstruct versus de-identify, generally speaking?
Yeah, so where people land afterwards matters a lot. So we think about the deconstruction. Many people have heard this term religious deconstruction before. This is the process of questioning, analyzing, doubting, struggling with your beliefs. Now, that can lead sometimes to reconstruction within one's faith, right? So that's kind of having like a faith that somewhat resembles what you came in with. It could be switching to another faith, but you're still kind of landing and reconstructing a set of beliefs, a worldview, a meaning system within a religious framework. Those are the reconstructors. The de-identifiers, they leave religion behind. They no longer want to be considered or identify as religious, but they still have to land somewhere. And so I think what matters the most is does the individual after the deconstruction process, whether they've reconstructed or they've de-identified, can they create a coherent worldview, a coherent system of meaning that allows them to make sense of the world, in which they feel significant and as though they matter, and as long as they have a purpose that's larger than themselves, where they can orient their lives and behavior. And so the ones that languish, the ones that do worse in this process are the ones that aren't able to land on eventually, this doesn't have to be right away, but eventually land with a coherent worldview that helps them make sense of the world. And one of the tricky things is that religion so neatly addresses so many big questions in life. So I tend to think of us not only we humans not only as meaning makers, but as inherently existentially aware animals, right? So we're aware of some of these big questions that all humans have had to grapple with, like how do I make decisions among seemingly attractive competing alternatives? How do I overcome my isolation? how do I answer the question of who am I? How do I deal with the certainty of death? How do I figure out my meaning in life? Religion can answer all of those things so neatly, so comprehensively, that if you're used to a one-stop shop to check off all of your existential boxes and provide you with a sense of meaning and security, it's going to be hard to shift to something that can't answer all those questions as comprehensively or as completely. And such individuals might feel a little bit of a loss. So the folks that tend to do a little poorer are the ones that can't find as strong of a meaning system after they deconstruct.
So for those that end up reconstructing their religious views rather than completely de-identifying, um, to what extent uh, are they motivated by using ritual to cope with anxiety, right? Because I mean, you just mentioned some large ideas that religion aids in, but at the end of the day, there's a day-to-day emotional piece associated with a lot of religious practice, which is there is a ritual, and that daily or weekly ritual serves some more basic emotional support, related to anxiety. Whether it's anxiety in general or something I want to talk about in a little bit, which is anxiety about death. How big of a role is the desire to have ritual for the sake of coping with anxiety?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think this loops a little bit back to what we talked about when we started our conversation today, when I introduced the idea of religious residue, right? So this is the idea that religion sticks with you even after you de-identify, even after you leave, or after you undergo some type of change or transition. And so for people who have been raised religiously, like you're saying, many of them do find comfort in the anxiety relieving features of rituals, whether that's prayer, chanting, yoga, meditation, being part of a community on a regular basis. Those are anxiety provoking meaning, or anxiety relieving rather, meaning providing features of religion. And so it is possible that some folks may say, gosh, I can't bear the possibility of being wrong, or I can't bear the uncertainty of not knowing. So I am going to stay within some type of tradition that provides me structure. And for those folks, the existential distress of that uncertainty and of not knowing is sufficient enough to keep them in there. And so that could be one feature of still practicing duns. Another feature why duns might still be practicing, even though maybe they've privately de-identified or might be questioning their beliefs, is because the social costs of leaving are simply just too high. So I chatted with a pastor one time, and I was at this conference, and he said, I'm going to tell something to you that I haven't told anybody but my wife. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this is going to be some type of, legal confession. I was very nervous. He said, even though I'm a pastor, I don't believe in any of this. Like I kind of lost my faith this past year. And I was like, oh my gosh, I'm really sorry to hear that. I'm sure that must be extremely challenging for you given your profession. He said, well, that's not the hard part. The hard part is I still have 6 more years until retirement. And I'm too late in my career to retire. And I've got all of my retirement in one account. I can't leave my family in the lurch. So I'm just going to keep on writing this pastor thing out, even though I don't believe. And I thought, my word, the amount of emotional turmoil and cognitive dissonance that person must be feeling has to be tremendous. And that has got to take a toll on somebody if they privately disbelieve, but publicly, are projecting this religious identity. And so I think, as we were kind of talking about, anxiety and these existential issues are so wrapped up in people's decisions around religion, whether they identify, when they leave, and what they do once they leave.
Wow, I'm still taken aback at that story. It's it's pretty fascinating. I mean, the mental gymnastics. A lot of as I was reading your book, I was thinking and reflecting about how human beings will put a ton of effort into integrating information that doesn't fit what we have, that we're operating with. And you actually do address this in detail. You talk about cognitive dissonance, and cognitive dissonance is this physiological arousal that we have when we have different we have a conflict between a couple beliefs that we're trying to resolve, or a conflict between a belief and a way that we've behaved. So maybe we think we're a punctual person, we showed up late. That makes us uncomfortable. We have to resolve that. Could you maybe talk a little bit more about cognitive dissonance and how that fits with the leaving religion piece? And it seems as though when it comes to doubt, the very beginning part, that it might be the most important.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm glad you brought this up. So in my mind, cognitive dissonance probably undergirds most reasons why people leave, right? So we've talked about two of the four main reasons why people leave. I call these the four horsemen of religion's apocalypse. So four main reasons why people leave. We've talked a little bit about the problematic label. So here the cognitive dissonance would be the way I see myself as religious is not really mapping on to other people's definitions of religion. There's that discrepancy. I can't make those things line up. I'm going to leave. The second was cultural stagnation. So what I believe and what I'm being taught are incongruent, and I can't make sense of those in a meaningful way. So I'm going to leave. The other two reasons why people might leave, I mentioned, are religious or spiritual abuse or trauma, or simplistic views of suffering. So I'll go through those other two really quickly. So with religious and spiritual abuse or trauma, if people have been experienced trauma or abuse at the hands of religious leaders or by religious institutions, or via religious means, it really kind of violates their sense of trust in an organization or in an institution or in people that they thought that they could trust. So I thought, well, I thought I could trust you. Now I can't. I can't make sense of what's happening to me. And really, I need to create some distance. I need to protect myself. I need to find safety. So I need to pull away. And the other is kind of this idea of a simplistic view of suffering. So ironically, most religions, if you go back, like for example, the chronologically, most scholars suggest that the first chronological book ever written in the Bible was Job, right? And this is a book all about how to make sense of senseless suffering, right? Buddhism is all about acknowledging the suffering in the world, and that to live is to experience suffering and how to deal with that suffering. However, in modern times, I often think that we receive theologically thin explanations for why suffering happens. We hear things like, well, everything happens for a reason, or the just world hypothesis. So, people get what they deserve. Good things happen to good people, bad things happen to bad people. Other people have called this the prosperity gospel or toxic positivity. That all is fine when your life is going well. But when something bad happens to you, then you're left wondering, well, am I a bad person? What did I do to deserve this? And it opens up, for people who believe in a God, it opens up this concern that scholars have termed as theodicy. So theodicy is the problem of evil, right? So if something bad happens, you know, and I believe that there's this all-loving, all-powerful, all-knowing God. Is it that God allowed it to happen? Did they cause it to happen? Did they just not care about me? How do I square those things up? And with overly simplistic views of suffering that don't account for the existence of evil, or don't account for not knowing or uncertainty, people just can't make sense of adversity or suffering, and so they leave. So in all four of those reasons, cultural stagnation, religious and spiritual abuse or trauma, simplistic views of suffering, or a problematic label, all of them share the common feature that people can't make sense of true beliefs or their beliefs and behavior. They experience cognitive dissonance, and try as they may to assimilate those experiences or those other teachings into their existing belief structure, or maybe they've tried for so long and they no longer can do that. They then have to do what's called accommodate, and that's shift the belief structure, shift your worldview, shift your meaning system. And for many, that means leaving religion, or shifting it in meaningful ways in which you no longer identify as religious.
Let's talk about the chasm that is left behind when someone leaves religion. I think you called it the gap or something like that in the book. I've heard this term, uh, the God-shaped hole. That when if someone leaves religion, it leaves behind a God-shaped hole, and it needs to be filled with something. And I think that this sentiment doesn't necessarily speak to morality. It speaks to the idea of humans have this need for a magical explanation for the unknown. It's this the idea that if we don't have religion, we're going to engage in some form of magical thinking to help us explain gaps in our knowledge. Would you say that that's accurate based on how you have measured changing beliefs?
Right. So like you mentioned, I call this the existential chasm, right? So the idea that people who were religious had all these existential answers to how to make decisions, what happens after you die, what's meaningful in life, and after leaving, they no longer have those. And so yeah, there's this real deep sense of loss and grief. If you believed in an afterlife and that was comforting for you in the past, now there's a couple things that you have to encounter. One is whatever you comforted yourself with in the past, like, oh, you lost a loved one, you're expecting to see that loved one again in the afterlife. If you no longer believe in the afterlife, you're almost re-grieving the fact that you've lost that person maybe forever now, right? That you're no longer going to see them. You're also grieving your own realization of no afterlife. And you're grieving the fact that you dedicated your life and may have made very high impact behavioral decisions around a worldview that you no longer ascribe to. And so for some people who come to this realization in their 30s and 40s, they may feel like, half of my life was dedicated towards something I no longer believe. I have all kinds of regrets. The religion says a whole bunch of things about what I can and shouldn't do with my body, around food and sex and drugs and substances. And people might feel like, well, if I didn't have those experiences, I want to go find them now, which may or may not fit where they are in life and other commitments that they've made. And so it can be incredibly disruptive. So, how does this relate to the God size hole? Well, if after walking away, if you're used to orienting your worldview and seeing the world in a particular way that's shaped by religion, the religious residue suggests you are going to go seek out similar types of ways to make sense of the world. And so we see this a little bit, for example, in politics, that after people leave religion, they become more politically liberal after they leave. And so for some people, they just sub out politics for the religion that they left behind. I love this William James quote that says, "A great number of people think they are thinking when they're merely rearranging their prejudices." Right. And so what this suggests is if people were raised really fundamentalist in one area and they leave religion, it's possible they might get really fundamentalist about something else. And if they're not moving towards politics, you mentioned this, we have to believe in something, right? I believe that, the evidence suggests we are inveterate meaning makers. We're kind of wired to believe something. If I can use the word very, very liberally, all of us are religious about something. Some of us are just religious about religion, right? Others of us get religious about other things. And by that, I just mean strongly and dogmatically committed to a particular worldview.
Yeah,
And so,
it reminds
yeah,
me. Daniel Dennett would always talk about belief in belief, and he more or less proposed that a lot of religious belief could be explained not by people wanting to believe in the nuts and bolts and the supernatural elements of religion, but they like the idea that another person would believe in something bigger than them.
right, right. I think that there's a lot of wisdom in that. We are so compelled by the act of believing. It's interesting that sometimes I think I agree with what you're saying. The content, it almost sometimes seems less relevant than the absolute pull of being transcendently connected to something greater than ourselves and investing in that hope providing belief. And so, I do think that for some people, especially if you were raised religiously and you were expected to believe things that seemed either miraculous or impossible, you're going to be more likely to, like you're saying, seek out some type of magical thinking that would be likewise impractical, impossible, or illogical. And so I kind of have a tender spot for religious duns after they leave religion that they might be vulnerable to people who might want to capitalize on their desire to find a new comprehensive meaning system or find a new strong leader to tell them what to believe. And those are areas in which I think people need to be aware when they're moving through this transition.
So, do we know, or do you know from your research, where people typically go first when they, and I'm talking specifically about moral views, morality. Do they go to philosophers? Do they just wing it? Where do people typically go to supplement or to try to repair their sense of moral wholeness?
This is a great question. So we currently have a $500,000 grant right now on spiritual yearning. So how people make meaning outside of organized religion. And this was one of the questions that we thought was going to be most pressing after people leave religion. We thought surely people are going to be yearning for this moral guidance because if religion provided this, they're really going to be looking for someone to tell them what's right and what's wrong. And largely what we found is people aren't really looking for that guidance as much. It's almost like I'm not saying nobody is looking for moral guidance, but I think most people kind of have a general sense of what's right and what's wrong. They kind of like, oh yeah, I kind of know what's moral and what's immoral. Um, and so at least to us, they're not indicating that there's this huge gap of, oh, now that I left religion, I've kind of lost my moral compass. I will say it could be that the use of morality, they kind of get turned off by that use because that's kind of very closely linked with religion. And maybe in the surveys, we need to ask these things in a better way. But we certainly aren't finding this to be a particularly strong area where people are suddenly confused or feel like without religion, religion was the only thing that keeping them back from living kind of a murderous or antisocial life. We're simply not seeing that in the data.
I mean, it makes sense. I think if you, I mean, if you're doubting a moral principle that is in a religious text, you have to. There's already something within you telling you, so it makes sense that there isn't necessarily a moral void. That people are transitioning to, trusting their instincts a little bit more. It sounds like.
Yeah.
So I did want to ask you because I didn't come across this at all in the book. Are people generally happier when they transition away from religion, or is there a pocket of de-identifiers that ultimately end up regretting perhaps that they've left?
Yeah, that is a great question. So I would say the data the data are mixed. And so we do know that the process of pulling away from religion is actually pretty tough on mental health. So leaving religion, people experience greater religious and spiritual struggles. So their sense of religion or view of God is very strained. We know that.
See, those types of findings are always interesting to me because it's kind of like it reminds me of exercise. Like if you exercise and you've never exercised, it's going to generate stress and it's going to make you feel bad. And if you were to look at a bunch of biomarkers, you might say, "Oh, strenuous exercise is bad for you because
Yeah.
we see all this, bad stuff going on in your cells, right, in the middle of strenuous exercise." But go ahead. Sorry to interrupt.
No,
It's
no, no.
interesting
I
when
know.
I hear
I
that.
think, yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And so I think what you're saying is some of these might just be growing pains of a shifting identity. And so, I tend to think about it in terms of, yeah, there are going to be aspects that actually feel a lot worse when you're pulling away. And there are going to be aspects which are better, and you didn't even realize they needed to be better or you didn't even realize they could be better, right? And so for some people, that process gives them a sense of integrity and authenticity they have long searched for. And so if some people were being judged for their identity, for their sexual orientation, their gender expression, and now they don't have that constant judgment, they don't feel ostracized from their religious communities, the amount of freedom and authenticity that people might experience, they may say, oh, well, okay, sure. Like on whatever you're measuring, I'll take the quote unquote costs of that because these benefits far outweigh it. Um, It depends. Some of it depends on how supportive their social system or network is. Where we hear a lot of struggle is when people are trying to, stay in relationship or explain the religious change with a religious family, right? The religious family might not be as accepting or understanding of the religious change. And so,
Yeah, it
we have,
seems like happiness. It's as you speak, I realize that it's too big of a question because I've met people who have had who've left very strict churches and they did not have that social environment and they were very very sad and aimless and I'm sure if I sat them down and I'm like do you feel better intellectually, they might say yes, but grand scheme of things, the well-being measures, not so much.
yeah. So yeah, definitely a mixed bag. And there's gonna be aspects where it's yes, and aspects where it might be no.
So to wrap up, um, why don't you speak to the listeners that are in the midst of questioning their faith? So they've had religious faith for quite some time, and they're right at that point where they're starting to question their faith. What is one piece of advice you would give to those individuals?
Great. So some advice that I would give to someone who is questioning their faith is to realize that this is a long process where you don't know what the outcome is going to be, but that doesn't mean that you have to be afraid. And so this is a process that takes time. When some people question, they're going to end up with a richer, more complicated, more nuanced set of belief commitments that's still religious. Some people will shift to a new religion, others will walk away completely. We don't know, but that doesn't mean you have to be afraid. And part of how you can draw courage is knowing that you're not alone. There's other people who have questioned, those who are currently questioning, those who will still be questioning in the future. And you can find other people to support you during this journey along the way of faith questioning.
Well, the name of the book, once again, is Done: How to Flourish After Leaving Religion. Thank you so much for being on today, Daryl Van Tongeren.
Thank you so much for having me.
For more on Daryl, visit his website at www.darylvantongeren.com or pick up a copy of Done: How to Flourish After Leaving Religion wherever books are sold. If you enjoy this podcast, please share an episode with two of your friends. Head over to patreon.com/whydowethatpodcast to become a paid supporter of the show. You'll gain early access to episodes as well as bonus video content. Follow on Instagram or Facebook at Why Do We Do That Podcast or on X at WDWDTpod. Until next time, this is Dr. Ryan Moyer, hoping you found some answers to the question, why do we do that?